The Black Woman in History, February 1975, by John Henrik Clarke. In 1959, when Cheikh Anta Diop's second book, The Cultural Unity of Negro Africa, was published in Paris by Présence Africaine, the Black Studies Revolution had not started in America. The African independence explosion was only 2 years old, having begun in 1957 with the independence of the Gold Coast in West Africa, now Ghana. This book was a continuation of the investigation into African history and culture that began with his first book, Nations Nègres et Culture, published in 1955. The Cultural Unity of Negro Africa was the second of the three major works that Cheikh Anta Diop had to complete before one was accepted, L'Afrique Noire Précoloniale, as suitable evidence that he was entitled to receive the degree Doctor of Letters. To the best of my knowledge, no student of history has ever written more or worked harder for a PhD. The books of Dr. Diop upset white scholars the world over and started a rage against him that has not abated. He challenged their interpretation of African history and backed his challenge with scholarship that they could not dismiss. Among the African writers using the French language, he launched the Afrocentric approach to history. Early in his work, Dr. Diop states his intent when he says, "I have tried to bring out the profound cultural unity still alive beneath the deceptive appearance of cultural heterogeneity. From this point of view, this work represents an effort of rationalization. It is clear that an African researcher is in a more privileged position than others, and consequently, there is no particular merit in his attempt to unearth the sociological laws which seem to be the foundation of the social reality in which he lives." In other words, the role of the African researcher is to proclaim the values of his society and not necessarily defend those values. This is precisely what Cheikh Anta Diop has done in this book. In his first chapter, An Historical Account of Matriarchy, he examines the theories of J.J. Backofen, Lewis M. Morgan, and Frederick Engels on the historical basis of the family. When these researchers look at non-European societies, they find them to be mainly matrilineal, descended from the woman's side of the family or through the female line. Dr. Diop extends the explanation in this way. The line of descent, he says, is matrilineal, and it is the man who brings the dowry to the woman. The latter does not leave her family group and can turn out her husband, who necessarily belongs to a different genes, if he fails to provide enough food for the common provender. Whatever may be the reason for any separation, the children remain entirely in the mother's genes. This proves, if proof is needed, that the women in these old societies had respected rights. Most of those societies developed before Europe was born. Dr. Diop is of the opinion that the matriarchal system, in its most highly developed form, is thus handed down to us by the pairing family. Early in the book, Dr. Diop deals with how some of the misconceptions about the African family became widespread in Europe. The left liberals in Europe generally looked at the African family through the pages of Frederick Engels' book, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. This book was very informative in what it has to say about the European family of Frederick Engels' day, but was in error in most of what it said about the family structure of African people. Dr. Diop observes that this difference of opinion is in no way an attack on Marxism. It is intended, he says, to show that a Marxist has made use in a theoretical work of material the soundness of which had not been proved. As a Marxist, Engels was interested in demonstrating the historicity, the temporary nature of all forms of political and social organization. Further, he was attempting to show that the traditional bourgeois monogamous family, far from being a permanent form, will be stricken by the same decay as previous institutions. The struggle between the matriarchy and the patriarchy in other societies, especially in Europe, meant something different in Africa, where there was less of a struggle. I think Frederick Engels, in his theories on the matriarchy, missed this important point. In chapter 2 of his book devoted to criticism of the classical theory of a universal matriarchy, Dr. Diop calls attention to societies such as the so-called Aborigines of Australia, where the two social systems, the matriarchy and the patriarchy, peacefully merged. When these societies in Africa and in the South Seas are compared with early Europe, we find that the European women have no basic rights. Dr. Diop observed, the husband was able to sell his wife or select an eventual husband for her in anticipation of his own death. Eunuchs were made to watch over the women. By contrast, the women of ancient Ethiopia had rights equal to that of men and equal power. Ethiopia was the first country in the world to have been ruled by a queen. Although Makeda, known as the Queen of Sheba, is the more remembered by historians, mainly because of her romance with King Solomon, she was not the greatest queen of ancient Ethiopia. The line of queens who took the name Candace were some of the most able female rulers of all time. The value of this book and of Dr. Diop's study of the domains of patriarchy and of matriarchy and classical antiquity is that it is also the study in essence of the African woman in power and of how that power developed. It is generally conceded in most scholarly circles that mankind originated in Africa. This makes the African man the father and the African woman the mother of mankind. In the first African societies, the women played a major role without demeaning the man or making his role less important. The first accomplishment of the African woman, in partnership with the man, was the creation of a functioning family unit. This major step in human development laid the foundation for the organization of all subsequent societies and institutions. In Africa, the woman's place was not only with her family, she often ruled nations with unquestionable authority. Many African women were great militarists and on occasion led their armies in battle. The Africans had produced a civilization where men were secure enough to let women advance as far as their talent, royal lineage, and prerogatives would take them. During the rise of the great dynasties in Egypt, Kush, and Ethiopia, the African women made impressive strides. Some became heads of state. The appearance of Queen Hatshepsut about 1500 years before the birth of Christ launched the beginning of their historical prominence in the affairs of state. Hatshepsut's reign was one of the brightest in Egyptian history, proving that a woman can be a strong and effective ruler. She was, according to the Egyptologist James Henry Breasted, the first great woman in history of whom we are informed. Dr. Diop writes that during the entire history of Egypt of pharaohs, African women enjoyed complete freedom, as opposed to the condition of the segregated Indo-European woman of the classical periods, whether she was Greek or Roman. He further informs us that no evidence can be found either in literature or in historical records, Egyptian or otherwise, relating to the systematic ill treatment of Egyptian women by their men. They were respected and went about freely and unveiled, unlike certain Asian women. Affection for one's mother, and especially the respect with which it was necessary to surround her, were the most sacred of duties. About 1800 BC, people from Western Asia, called the Middle East, began to come into Africa, first as migrants, later as invaders. These people were no strangers to the Africans. Egypt had formerly been their colonial master. These people were of a lower culture, and like all invaders, contributed nothing to Africa but trouble. 1,000 years after their arrival, some of them were still nomads, confused by the higher cultures developed in Africa before their arrival. Egypt played host to most of these migrants until they began to form hostile coalitions directed against Egypt. The African people's traditional hospitality to strangers was being abused. This abuse lasted for more than 3,000 years and continues to this very day. In a recent book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Great Issues of a Race. From 4,500 to 2000 AD, the Afro-American historian Dr. Chancellor Williams of Howard University has dealt searchingly with the impact of invaders on Africa. He also deals with the evidence that tends to show the Southern African origins of Egypt, a subject mainly distorted or neglected by white historians who are overly preoccupied with the Hamitic hypothesis that attempts to prove that all the high cultures of Africa were brought in from the outside and that the ancient Egyptians were white people. Nothing is further from the truth. In chapter 2 of Dr. Williams's book, Ethiopia's Oldest Daughter, Egypt, the nonsense about white Egypt is put to rest. In dealing with the invaders of Africa, Dr. Williams explains, the techniques of penetration and dominance were varied. Some came as peaceful traders, and doubtless trade was all that was intended by many. Africans were always eager traders. The main attraction of foreign traders was they brought in many new kinds of commodities. These traders had little or no trouble in gaining coastal footholds as trading posts. The land was not sold, but leased. However, the blacks had what the world wanted most: gold, diamonds, ivory, copper, iron, ore, and themselves. After many of these traders settled along the coast of Africa, they turned their trading posts into fortifications and enslaved some of the Africans who had invited them there. They began a war on African customs, religion, and cultures. In most cases, the first custom they attacked was the matriarchy, attacks which increased after the Muslim invasion of Africa. What the invaders forgot, if indeed they knew, is that the matriarchy could be as old as organized societies in Africa. Chances are that the matriarchy in other parts of the world could have spread from Africa. What is needed is an Afrocentric view of the African women in power. Sometime around 1386 BC, Queen Tai of Egypt gave birth to a boy who was first named Amenhotep after his father. While growing up, his closest companion was said to be Nefertiti, his beautiful little cousin. When the crown prince was about 21, he and the lovely Nefertiti were married. After the death of his father, Amenhotep came to full power in Egypt and took the name Akhenaton, often referred to as the heretic king. He was one of the most extraordinary monarchs in history. His queen was equally extraordinary. Akhenaton and Nefertiti humanized the Egyptian monarchy. After his death, Nefertiti almost single-handedly tried to keep alive the new religion that he had founded. Egypt's golden age gradually waned, and the pride and splendor that had marked the 18th and 19th dynasties gave way to internal strife and confusion. Wars of conquest and colonization had drained much of her military and economic strength. In the meantime, as the nations to the south grew more powerful, they came predatory toward Egypt, which had once been their master. The nation that is now called Ethiopia came back upon the center stage of history around 960 BC. It was then represented by a queen who in some books is referred to as Makeda and in others as Belkis. She is better known to the world as the Queen of Sheba. In his book, World's Great Men of Color, J.A. Rogers gives this description. Out of the mists of 3,000 years emerges this beautiful love story of a black queen who, attracted by the fame of a Judean monarch, made a long journey to see him. In Ethiopia, A Cultural History, Sylvia Pankhurst tells the story of this journey. The history of the Queen of the South who undertook a long and arduous journey to Jerusalem in order to learn of the wisdom of King Solomon, is deeply cherished in Ethiopia as part of the national heritage, for she is claimed as an Ethiopian queen, Makeda, a woman of splendid beauty, who introduced the religion and culture of Israel to her own land. The story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba is quite well known. Dr. Post Wheeler, in his book Golden Legend of Ethiopia, maintains that the Queen of the South was called the Queen of Sheba and Axum, and that she reigned over Sheba and Arabia as well as Ethiopia. Another valuable old Ethiopian work, the Book of Axum, states that when Queen Makeda came to the throne, she built the capital in the Ethiopian district of Azeba. The Keber Nagas, an ancient Ethiopian chronology, tells us that the Queen of Sheba's capital was Debre Makeda, or Mount Makeda, which the queen built and named for herself. Debre Makeda later became a meeting place for the early Christians of Ethiopia. In Ethiopia's Church of Axum, there is a copy of what is said to be one of the tables of law that Solomon gave to Menelik, his son, by the Queen of Sheba. Menelik had gone from Ethiopia to visit his father in Judea. This African queen is mentioned in two holy books, the Bible and the Quran. The Greeks spoke of her as the Black Minerva and the Ethiopian Diana. More nonsense has been written about Cleopatra than about any other African queen, mainly because it has been the desire of many writers to paint her white. She was not a white woman, she was not a Greek. Let us dispose of this matter before explaining the more important aspects of her life. Until the emergence of the doctrine of white superiority, Cleopatra was generally pictured as a distinctly African woman, dark in color. Shakespeare, in the opening line of Antony and Cleopatra, calls her tawny. In his day, mulattoes were called tawny Moors. The word Moor came into the European languages meaning black or blackamoor. In the book of Acts, Cleopatra describes herself as black. Born in 69 BC, Cleopatra came to the throne that she shared with a brother, Ptolemy XIII, when she was 18. Egypt, now a Roman protectorate, was beset with internal strife and intrigue. Cleopatra aligned herself with Julius Caesar, who reinforced her power. Their political and sexual relationship was a maneuver to save Egypt from the worst aspects of Roman domination. After Julius Caesar was murdered, Cleopatra, still in her early 20s, met Mark Antony, and a love affair, strongly motivated by politics, began. Her effect on Mark Antony was profound. This noble Roman turned traitor to his own people when he attempted to save the country of this fascinating black queen from Roman domination. After Antony's death, the victor, Octavius, assumed full control of Egypt, and Cleopatra, now without a protector or champion, committed suicide. After Cleopatra's death, Egypt became a Roman colony, and the harsher aspects of Roman rule settled over Egypt and the Middle East. To the south, in the lands untouched by Rome, new proud civilizations were rising, and in the centuries that followed, black women once again began to play major roles in the theater of history. Christianity was born and developed largely on the soil of Africa, and from its inception was a religion of the oppressed. This religion, which enjoyed a relatively peaceful existence during its formative years in North Africa and the Middle East, held as one of its best-known icons a black woman nursing her child. Christianity arose when Imperial Rome ruled most of North Africa and the Middle East, at a time when men were questioning old gods and searching for new ones. The idea of a virgin mother and child had appeared in many ancient civilizations, among them Babylonia and Egypt. Isis was the name of the North African goddess who gave virgin birth to the child Horus. As the Black Virgin, Isis was worshipped in hundreds of temples in Africa, Spain, Italy, and France. The spread of Christianity throughout Europe and the evolution of European nationalism resulted in the gradual replacement of the Black Madonnas by the later white Madonna and Child. But many European churches have retained their Black Madonnas, and the great Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris is built on the site of an earlier shrine of the Black Madonna. It was only after the Council of Ephesus in 431 that the Virgin Mary and Child became the symbols of the Christian religion. After this time, Madonnas began to appear in Europe in large numbers, most of the early ones being black. For example, Italy has one in the shrine at Loreto, and others can be seen at Orapa, Genoa, Pisa, and Padua. Switzerland has one at Einsiedeln. Several Madonnas in France are referred to as Vierges Noires. The Bible itself tells us more about the role of black women and their relationship to the Christian story. Genesis 46:20 tells us about Joseph's two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, whose mother was Asenath, daughter of an African priest. Moses, who was born in Africa and spent most of his life there, journeyed to Ethiopia to marry Zipporah, daughter of Jethro the Midianite. They had two sons, Gershom and Eleazar, Exodus 18:6. Many of the Hebrews in Egypt married African women who were natives of countries to the south. Many scholars of history today believe that the ancient Hebrew people, like the ancient Egyptians, were dark-skinned. Inquiries into the ethnic identity of Jesus Christ have been common for years, and these inquiries ultimately lead to a related question: who was the mother of Mary? In 1914, W.E.B. Du Bois, then editor of the Crisis magazine, noted in an editorial entitled "The Color of the Lord." Several persons have written us objecting to the intimation in our advertising columns that Jesus Christ was not a white man. We confess to a certain lack of interest in the subject, but are forced in self-defense to publish this note from the Cambridge Encyclopedia Company concerning their coin collection. Among other rare pieces, our collection contains a gold solidus of Justinian II, circa AD 705, which was purchased from Lincoln and Company, the well-known numismatists of Oxford Street, London, after having been verified as genuine by the coin department of the British Museum. The obverse is stamped with the full-face bust of Justinian, with robe, carré, and cross. Legend: Justinianus, serve. Christi, Justinian, servant of Christ. Reverse: full-face bust of Jesus Christ with woolly hair. Behind him, the cross. Legend: DMIESCHSRESREGNANTIUM, Dominus Noster, Jesu Christo, King of Kings. Whatever the fact, this coin places beyond dispute the belief that Jesus Christ was a Negro. The coin is otherwise of great historical interest, for it was the cause of a war between Justinian and Abdullah Malik, fifth caliph of the Omniads, the former demanding tribute to be paid in these same coins, and the latter refusing. From this evidence, it is easy to arrive at the conclusion that the Mother Mary was black. Her son, Jesus Christ, is described as having hair like lamb's wool and being swarthy in complexion. In looking at the black woman as a figure in world history, it should be remembered that the universal symbol of womanhood and purity was originally considered by many early Christians to be a black woman. African women played a major role in the formative development of Christianity. One of the most noted of these was Hypatia, who appeared in history at the time when European opposition to Christianity was waning and many people were becoming Christians. In the book Introduction to African Civilization by John G. Jackson, the following is stated about Hypatia and her time. In the early part of the 5th century of the Christian era, Hypatia, the daughter of Theon, the mathematician, conducted an academy in Alexandria. This talented lady gave lectures on the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle and instructed her students on the works of Apollonius and other geometers. Bishop Cyril decided that such knowledge must be suppressed, and he proceeded to take the necessary steps to achieve that objective. The great tragedy that befell Hypatia is best described by an eminent historian of science who informs us each day before her academy stood a long train of chariots. Her lecture rooms were crowded with the wealth and fashion of Alexandria. They came to listen to her discourses on those questions which man in all ages has asked, but which never yet have been answered. What am I? Where am I? What can I know? Hypatia and Cyril, philosophy and bigotry, they cannot exist together. So Cyril felt, and on that feeling he acted. As Hypatia repaired to her academy, she was assaulted by Cyril's mob, a mob of many monks. Stripped naked in the street, she was dragged into a church and there killed by the club of Peter the Reader. The corpse was cut to pieces, the flesh was scraped from the bones with shells, and the remains cast into a fire. For this frightful crime, Cyril was never called to account. Henceforth, there was to be no freedom for human thought. Everyone must think as the ecclesiastical authority ordered him. A.D. 414. In Athens itself, philosophy awaited its doom. Justinian at length prohibited its teaching and caused all its schools in that city to be closed. The politicalization of the Christian church and the growing dissatisfaction with Roman rule in North Africa and in the Middle East helped to facilitate the rise of Islam. While some North Africans welcomed this new religion, others resisted it. Resistance was put up by Kusela, a general in Mauritania, and his relative, Queen Dahia al-Kahina. Many North Africans rallied under the banner of Kusela and were defeated in 682. He continued to rule Mauritania for 5 years, but in 688 was defeated and killed by a new contingent of Arab troops. His position as leader of African resistance was assumed by Queen Dahia al-Kahina. Under her leadership, the Africans fought back fiercely and drove the Arab army northward into Tripolitania. These furious counterattacks made some of the Arab governors doubt that Africa could be conquered. After the Arab general Hassan bin Numan captured Carthage in 698, his victory proved to be short-lived. Queen Kahina soon rallied her forces and drove him from her capital. When Kahina's position became desperate, she ordered that the fertile districts be laid waste so that the lack of food and shelter would discourage the Arabs from returning. The ruinous effect on the soil of southern Tunisia can be seen to this day. Queen Kahina was of the Hebrew faith, and she never abandoned her religion. Her opposition, then, was purely nationalistic, since she favored neither the Christians nor the Muslims. She was finally defeated and slain by Hassan bin Numan in 705. Her death ended one of the most valiant attempts to save Africa for the Africans. She stood astride the path of Islam and prevented its southward spread into the western Sudan. After her death, the Arabs began to change their strategy in advancing their faith and their power in Africa. A partnership arose between the African and the Arabs that would last 300 years. The most important consequence of this alliance was the Muslim conquest of Spain in the year 711. Most history books record this event as a joint African-Arab venture, but militarily, it was chiefly an achievement of Black Africans under the leadership of an African general, Gebel Tariq. While the power and influence of Africans was rising in Spain, great states began to emerge in other parts of Africa, principally in West Africa. The best known of these states were Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. In these states, women not only played major roles, but sometimes rose to be heads of state. The great Arab traveler Ibn Battuta, a Muslim, was appalled at the freedom that women enjoyed in West Africa when he visited Mali in 1352. The European slave trade originated during the 15th century at a time when the once powerful West African states were suffering internal disputes after more than 1,000 years of grandeur. The decline of these states produced a weakness in West Africa that frustrated any resistance to imposition of the slave trade, and thus the long night of tragedy began for Africa. The carefully built African family structure was, in many cases, destroyed. African bravery was no match for a new force that had been introduced into the world. This force was gunpowder. In the 16th century, the Portuguese stake in the slave trade was threatened by England and France. This caused the Portuguese to transfer their slave trading activities southward to the Congo and Southwest Africa. Their most stubborn opposition, as they entered the final phase of the conquest of Angola, came from a queen who was a great head of state and a military leader with few peers in her time. The important facts about her life are delineated in the forthcoming book, Queen Nzinga and the Mbundu Resistance to the Portuguese Slave Trade by Professor Roy A. Glasgow of Bowie State College, Bowie, Maryland. In the book, he writes, her extraordinary story begins in 1583, the year of her birth. She is known as Jinga or Ginga, but more often as Nzinga, and she was the sister of the then reigning king of Ndongo, Ngoli Bondi, whose country was later called Angola. Nzinga belonged to an ethnic group called the Jagas. The Jagas were an extremely militant group who formed a human shield against the Portuguese conquest of her country and was always on the military offensive. As part of her excellent strategy against the invaders, she formed an alliance with the Dutch, whom she intended to use to defeat the Portuguese slave traders. At her request, she was given a body of Dutch soldiers. The officer commanding this detachment in 1646 said this of her: a cunning and prudent virago, so much addicted to arms that she hardly uses other exercises, and withal so generously valiant that she never hurt a Portuguese after quarter was given, and commanded all her servants and soldiers alike. She believed that after defeating the Portuguese, it would be easy to surprise the Dutch and expel them from her country. Consequently, she continued to maintain an amicable relationship with them and patiently waited for the appropriate time to turn against them. Her ultimate ambitions extended beyond the aim of freeing her country from European control. In addition to retaining personal control of Ndongo, she hoped to expand her domain from Matamba in the east to the Atlantic Ocean. To this end, she made herself an astute agitator propagandist who could easily summon large groups of her fellow countrymen to listen to her. In convincing her people of the pernicious influences of the Portuguese, she would single out slaves and slave soldiers who were under Portuguese control and direct intensive political and patriotic messages their way, appealing to their pride in being Africans. She offered them land and freedom. This resulted in the desertion of thousands of these slave soldiers who joined her forces, forming a serious security problem for the Portuguese. A visionary political leader, competent, self-sacrificing, and devoted to the resistance movement, Nzinga attempted to attract to her cause as many kings and heads of families as possible, so that through the allegiance of their people, she could gain new recruits for the defense of her country against the occupation of the Portuguese. In 1623, at the age of 41, Nzinga became Queen of Ndongo, and she began at once to strengthen her position of power. She forbade her subjects to call her queen. She preferred to be called king, and, when leading her army in battle, dressed in men's clothing. Her most enduring weapon was her personality. She was astute and successful in consolidating power. She was particularly good at safekeeping her position by ruthlessly dealing with her foes and graciously rewarding her friends. She possessed both masculine hardness and feminine charm, which she readily used, depending on the need and the occasion. Because of these attributes, her leadership was never seriously challenged. The Portuguese began to have second thoughts about her. Their priests were disappointed because they had seemingly lost the battle to convert her to Catholicism. In point of fact, this was not the case. She would later choose her own time and reason to join their church and to use this liaison for her own purposes. In 1645 and again in 1646, she suffered a series of setbacks in her campaign to drive the Portuguese out of Angola. Her sister Fungi was taken as a prisoner of war. The Portuguese beheaded her and threw her body in a river. Nzinga began to weigh the merits of her own god, Tembondumba, as compared to the god of the Portuguese. Was it possible, she asked, that the Catholic God was stronger? She had heard the Jesuits maintain that the Christian God was just and an enemy of all suffering. Why then did he assist the invaders of her country? Why were the Portuguese building forts in her country without her consent? With her question still unresolved, she decided to join their religion and to test its strength in her favor. And for the remainder of her life, she used this religion as a political tool when it suited her. In 1659, she signed a treaty with the Portuguese that brought her no feeling of triumph. Now more than 75 years old, she had resisted the Portuguese for most of her adult life. Some of her faithful assistants and followers had died or given up the long fight. On December 17, 1663, this great African woman died. With her death, the Portuguese occupation of the interior of Southwest Africa began. The massive expansion of the Portuguese slave trade followed this event. In the concluding chapter of his book about Nzinga's life and struggles, Professor Roy A. Glasgow has this to say: Queen Nzinga symbolized the quintessence of early Mbundu resistance. She was from 1620 until her death in 1663, the most important personality in Angola. Nzinga failed in her mission to expel the Portuguese and become Queen of Ethiopia, embracing Matamba, Eastern Ndongo, and Ndongo. However, her historic importance transcends this failure as she awakened and encouraged the first known stirring of nationalism in West Central Africa by organizing the national and international, the Moni Congo, resistance in her total opposition to European domination. In the resistance to the slave trade and the colonial system that followed the death of the Queen, African women, along with their men, helped to mount offenses all over Africa. Among the most outstanding were Madame Tinubu of Nigeria, Nandi, the mother of the great Zulu warrior Chaka, Kipkere of the Herero people of Southwest Africa, and the female army that followed the great Dahomean king Bahanzin Baweli. Islam had a shattering effect on the matriarchy in Africa without destroying it. The social organization of the Bantu-speaking people of Central Africa continued to be governed by the matriarchy. The greatest impact of Islam was along the east coast of Africa and in the western Sudan. Cheikh Anta Diop has given us a historical accounting of this impact. In spite of the slave trade and the colonial system that followed it, African women continued to be important factors in the physical struggles against European domination. Their participation continued throughout the 19th and well into the 20th century in the country south of Angola, Namibia, that the Europeans developed. During this time, the country was plunged into a prolonged struggle against one of the strongest colonial powers of that time. German soldiers were mobilized with all modern armaments against the Herero people of Southwest Africa. The Herero women, despite their lack of modern equipment, took on responsibilities equal to their men and waged a war against the Germans that resulted in a stalemate. Near the end of the 19th century, 1896, the British, in their attempt to take over the hinterlands of the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, exiled King Prempeh. In 1900, still not having succeeded in gaining control of this part of Ghana, the British sent a governor to Kumasi, the capital of Ashanti, to demand the golden stool, the Ark of the Covenant, and the supreme symbol of the sovereignty and independence of the Ashantis, a fierce and warlike people who inhabit the dense rainforests of what is now the central portion of Ghana. On March 28, 1900, the governor, Lord Hodgson, called a meeting of all the kings in and around the city of Kumasi. He informed the people that their exiled king Prempeh would not be permitted to return because the indemnity the British had demanded before the exile of King Prempeh had not been paid. Further, he demanded that the Ashanti surrender the golden stool. The demand was a terrible blunder and an insult to the Ashanti people who were still angry with the British for exiling the king. The governor in no way understood the sacred significance of the stool, which according to tradition contained the soul of the Ashanti. The Ashanti heard the governor's speech and showed no reaction except silence. The meeting broke up quietly and the men went home to prepare for war. The inspiring force behind the Ashanti people at this time was Ya Asantewa, the queen mother of Ejisu. The war that followed bears her name, the Ya Asantewa War. The story of Ya Asantewa is woven throughout the history of modern Ghana. The following story of the great queen and her war is taken from the book Ghana, A History for Primary Schools by E.A. Addy. In the evening, the chiefs held a secret meeting at Kumasi. Ya Asantewa, the queen mother of Ejisu, was at the meeting. The chiefs were discussing how they should make war on the white men and force them to bring back the Asantehene. Ya Asantewa saw that some of the chiefs were afraid. Some said that there should be no war. They should rather go to beg the governor to bring back the Asantehene, King Prempeh. Then suddenly, Ya Asantewa stood up and spoke. This was what she said. Now I have seen that some of you fear to go forward to fight for our king. If it were in the brave days of old, the days of Osei Tutu, Okomfo Anokie, and Opoku Ware, chiefs would not sit down to see their king taken away without firing a shot. No white man could have dared to speak to chiefs of the Ashanti in the way the governor spoke to you chiefs this morning. Is it true that the bravery of Ashanti is no more? I cannot believe it. Yea, it cannot be. I must say this. If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. We, the women, will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white men. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefields. The speech stirred up the chiefs, and at once the meeting swore the great oath of Ashanti to fight the white men until they released the Asantehene. Ya Asantewa was the leader in this war. Then the Ashantis cut telegraph wires and surrounded Kumasi. The governor and his party kept themselves in the fort, where they suffered from disease and hunger. For many months, the Ashantis, led by Ya Asantewa, fought very bravely and kept the white men in the fort. Then an officer, Colonel Wilcox, was sent with 1,400 soldiers to Kumasi. He brought very big guns. Ya Asantewa and the other Ashanti leaders were captured. They were deported and the war came to an end. Ya Asantewa's name and her bravery are always remembered. After this war, Ya Asantewa and some of the other leaders were sent into exile. The Ashanti Wars against the British had started in 1805 and had lasted for nearly 100 years. But with the end of this last war, the British gained control over the hinterland of Ghana. And Ya Asantewa's war was the last of the major wars in Africa led by a woman. But Ya Asantewa only added to that long line of African warrior queens that began with Hatshepsut 1,500 years before the birth of Christ, because her agitation for the return of Prempeh was converted into the stirring demands for independence. it is safe to say that she helped to create the theoretical basis for the political emergence of modern Africa. In his book on the domains of patriarchal and matriarchal societies in classical antiquity, Cheikh Anta Diop has arrived at some conclusions that are as topical as they are historical. His book furnishes the basis for an honest re-examination of the relationships between men and women in societies in general, and in African society in particular.